All right, welcome back to OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your hosts, Adam Armbrecht and Andy Makowitz, and this is going to be a juicy one because we have everything covered from ownership all the way down to practice squad players for Big Blue, coming off a loss there on the weekend. Sometimes you got to lick your wounds so long, Andy, that it takes a couple of days after you just get embarrassed by the Philadelphia Eagles.
Well, listen, I saw a lot of positives in that game. I saw a lot of positives. I know we were down 30 points in the fourth quarter. I know we didn't have the time of possession at that time. We had 100 passing yards and 80 rushing yards to their 200 and 150. There was a lot of positives though, right? We kicked a field goal. We got in the end zone once. Just nothing but positives. And I know you can't see it, Adam, but that's because you're not really looking through it with rose-colored glasses.
I get so used to the way I introduce the show with my co-host Andy Makowitz, but today's going to be a special one. We have Joe Judge. He's filling in, and he's going to give you the perspective that everybody needs. I mean, good Lord, we'll get to him in a second, but got to start out with what I think is arguably the most important piece of information to come out over the last few days. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I'm going to give you 20 minutes, as much time as you need, Andy. Sam Beal officially released by the New York Football Giants.
Oh, I mean, Listen, this is a tough one. I think he might actually be like the perfect microcosm of what's been wrong for the last few years, right? Like we used a supplemental pick on him, third rounder. According to things, he had two bad shoulders. He got hurt right away. Even when he was on the field, he wasn't very good. He sat out, and then he's on the practice squad and he's been holding on for dear life. And we haven't cut ties with him. We finally do it in week 16 to 17. Why has he even been in the building at all? And this is just a microcosm of what the Giants have been. It's like we hold on to players for too long because we spent capital on them. And I think he is the perfect. And then week 16, without seeing him on the field at all, we just let him go and he goes on his merry way. It makes no sense.
Well, it's one of those things where, because they say certain players are coming back and roster spots and all that stuff. But to your point, it's week 16.
Yeah.
At that point, I'm like, man, I can't wait to see Sam Beal be 100% healthy and play in training camp next year. You know what I mean? At that point, I'm like, well, there must be something that this guy is doing, because if not, you could have brought in any random 2 years younger player to be on your practice squad at any position that could have had value. So the fact that you wait all the way until week 16 to do it, it's not like you haven't brought in other cornerbacks to come in and fill in for actual game day reps. You've made all these moves, and yet it took you this long on Sam Beal. We won't belabor that because we have a lot to get to, but we like to have fun, guys, because that's what this season's about. Let's start with coming out of that game, because the most recent thing I think is this perspective around the NFL. Well, around the NFL is a little bit maybe broad stroke, around Twitter and needing to see certain players, right? So we come out of this game, Matt Peart tears his ACL. You have Julian Love going into protocols. These all mean different things, but specifically, you've been kind of I'll say you're close to being on tilt around the Matt Peart piece. And listen, you and I have gone back and forth around Nate Solder and the fact that he was starting, but over the course of the season, it became pretty clear why a bad, old, looks like slightly broken down Nate Solder was getting the bulk of the reps.
This is what I was talking to you about, even in the offseason, where I told you there is a world where Nate Solder is our starting tackle.
But it was a bad world, Andy.
I know,
it was a bad world.
And I will forgive you because it was a reality that you didn't want to live in that moment, right? I get that. It was more like I could see it, but if that happens, then I'm in a really dark place. And then of course that's what happens. But everyone, sees Nate Solder out there struggling, grabbing guys every single time they get by him, trying to just avoid letting his quarterback get killed, taking holding penalties left and right. They saw that and they were like, Matt Peart, he has to be out there. This is insane. The coaching staff doesn't know what they're doing. Well, we've seen what happened with Peart when he went out there. He was abysmal. He had a 10 Pro Football Focus passer, pass blocking rating, which I didn't even know you could do. I didn't even know that existed. And I feel bad for the injury. We could talk about what that means for him in a little bit. But you have that one was the first one where everyone's like, the coaching staff doesn't know what they're talking about. Right. And granted, the the coaching staff doesn't have too many legs to lean on
those
at this moment.
those things
But
don't necessarily have to be tied together, right? You
right.
can.
Then it comes out. We've seen Mike Glennon. Everyone is tired of what Mike Glennon's putting out on the field, and they're like, we need to see Jake Fromm. Jake Fromm has to be the guy, right? Then Jake Fromm goes out there against the Eagles, completes like 25 to 30% of his passes, throws for about 25 to 30 yards. And everyone's like, oh, right. That's why he couldn't beat out Mike Glennon. Because Mike Glennon has started 30 games in the NFL. And even though he's not good, like we see what's behind door number 2 with Jake Fromm, which is not pleasant. And so the last thing I will say, now forward looking, is we keep hearing online, everyone's like, Isaiah Wilson, the troubled, offensive tackle now turned over to offensive lineman, potentially at guard. Everyone's saying, we got to see him instead of Skura or any of the other guys that look terrible. And I just want to caution everyone one more time, Adam, that we've seen this with Solder. We've seen this with Glennon. We've seen this with other people. Like, there's a reason why Isaiah Wilson isn't out there. If the Giants had the silver bullet sitting on the bench that was going to shore up the offensive line, do you think Joe Judge would have put him in? Do you think Jason Garrett, before he got fired, would have maybe said, hey, this guy looks pretty good, let's throw him in? He's clearly out of shape. He's learning a new position, and he's not ready. So, like, I understand people want to see a shiny new toy because they hate what they see now, but it's going to get someone killed on that offensive line. Saquon Barkley could tear his ACL. One of our quarterbacks could get destroyed for a concussion. Like, we got to be a little bit smarter, right, Adam?
Well, I think it's funny because you go back to when they brought him in, and we both thought, "Hey, this could be something." But time gives you perspective, and that's what I think fans are failing to realize. Like, if you don't hear anything about Isaiah Wilson for 1, 2, 3, 4, nay 5 weeks, right? Like, it means that whatever's going on behind the scenes, it's taking time, and that's fine. Like, you didn't think just because they brought him in, it automatically was going to be the answer, but you have to see how the player develops, a position change, etc. And the one thing I think we could credit, I mean, credit's probably the wrong way to phrase it, but this coaching staff, at the very least, like, we understand that the team isn't good enough, right? That they don't have enough talent on the offensive line, that they've had a lot of injuries, and finding guys to replace wide receivers is difficult. And you're missing guys, you're missing your captain and anchor of the defense in Blake Martinez, but it's not just a like for like replacement with talent. And to your point, like at a certain threshold, you go, well, is an old veteran player better than someone who either hasn't been playing football or is young and inexperienced? Any of those factors? Yeah, it is. Because you at least have a floor of what this player is going to give you. And to your point, right? Like, Nate Solder is a great, you said it earlier, a microcosm of this team. Is he grabbing guys? Of course he is. You'd like to think that more often than not, he's grabbing guys when he knows that if I don't, I'm going to get somebody hurt. Whereas we've seen with Matt Peart, and we feel bad that he got injured. We've seen Matt Peart just flat out get beat. His opportunity to grab somebody wasn't even there. And I think that's, splitting hairs here, Donnie. But unfortunately, that's where we're at when it comes to offensive line play. We'd rather have the guy that understands and is capable of grabbing someone and taking a holding penalty than the player who sometimes looks like he's turning the wrong direction on a block. So that's concerning in and of his own right. I think you're 100% correct on it. And, briefly, big picture on Matt Peart, because I want to get into the front office stuff. We want to talk a little bit about some of the commentary coming out of that Eagles game, and actually going into it as well. But if you're Peart, you're a third round pick, and this has not been the year 2 that you were, planning on. Certainly not what the Giants were planning on either. Now, this is where the evaluation process comes into question, because they came in thinking you were going to be a starting offensive tackle for them, and that clearly has not panned out. Now, all of a sudden, you want to swarth this into Dave Gettleman and how we feel about him, and is he the next lame duck guy, however responsible he is for however many decisions? This is a guy that maybe isn't even going to be on this roster next year, depending on who comes in and what decisions have to get made. And that's it's a third round pick, but it's a third round pick that people were excited about just 6 months ago. And now all of a sudden we're looking at a player that maybe is a backup around the league, or is maybe going to end up getting the Eric Flowers treatment, where he needs to go somewhere else, change positions, learn something new, and then become an effective, serviceable NFL player.
Well, it is kind of worrying. I mean, you look at the cap numbers, and the Giants can save 700 something $1,000 by just outright releasing Matt Peart in the offseason. And 700 grand might seem inconsequential right now. But the question is, like, is he even a serviceable swing back backup in the NFL right now, coming
Right.
off of a terrible ACL injury and not showing any signs of progression. My answer is probably not. You could probably put that 700 grand towards something else. It actually saves you $1 million basically in the 4th year of his deal. And like when we're thinking about refixing this cap, those are the types of decisions that the Giants are going to have to make. Unfortunately, I don't even know if he's a depth piece anymore, just based on the action that we've seen. Now, is it a big deal if they end up keeping him? Not really. Like I said, it's under $1 million, but it definitely calls it into question. He's coming off an ACL injury, and the Giants are going to have to make a decision because clearly they're going to have to revamp the offensive line anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, is $1 million a ton? Not really, but remember, you go into the NFL season, you want to have $8 to $10 million earmarked for the what ifs that can occur over the course of the year. So when you're looking at back end of the roster and guys that haven't performed very well, is it just as good to have the money as opposed to have this player? And then again, who knows who's going to be available on the landscape? Who knows who's going to be available in the draft? You might as well, depending on the GM, reset the timetable on, as you say, a backup swing tackle, because we're not talking about, no longer can we sit here and talk about Matt Peart, the starter. Could that be in his future somewhere? Maybe. But like this year has told us that maybe last season and the shuffling of offensive linemen, right, and playing rep for rep and rotating like that, that's because none of these guys were necessarily capable of doing it consistently on a down in, down out basis. So we'll keep an eye on that. But yeah.
I want to go through something and I want to give you a few set of names, and I hadn't prepped you with this, but I want to hit you with this, and maybe it'll open up a larger discussion. I've got a few names for you. Tell me what they have in common. Matt Peart, O'Shane Ximenez, Lorenzo Carter, Davis Webb, Darian Thompson, Odizingwa, and Jay Bromley. What do they have in common?
Well, I thought O'Shane Ximenez was a 4th-round pick, but I was going to say they were all 3rd-round picks for the New York Football Giants.
Those are all of our 3rd-round picks since 2014. You can keep going back to Demontre Moore in 2013. 2012 was Jaron Hosley. Like, when you think about the first 3 rounds.
By the way, the names, I'll jump the gun here. None of those names really make you get excited. Although I stand by the fact that Lorenzo Carter still remains a viable player for the New York Football Giants.
But think about it. Like when you're drafting third, like in the first 3 rounds, those are foundational building block pieces for every team,
early
right?
3rd-round picks, right? Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, the Giants haven't been good. So these are generally early 3rd-round picks for the Giants as well. But like, you're talking about getting top 100 players. I just listed our last 9 years, almost 10 years of 3rd-round draft picks. And that's what it comes down to. Who's left on the team? A couple of guys from the last 2 years. We just drafted Matt Peart a year ago, and we're already talking about releasing him. Like, that's the state of this franchise right now, is we're not hitting on any of these picks. Like, we don't have any foundational guys, even in the 3rd round over the last decade. That is not a recipe for success. And you think about how many guys are we, forget about that. It's like, how many guys are even worthy of a second contract, right? And that's where the big problem that the Giants have right now.
No, 100%. And you think about, they always say it's like, you get the sexy players, the big names, the guys that are going to be home run hitters for you, the franchise quarterbacks. Those come in the 1st round, even into the 2nd round, certain positions. But 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round, like these are the guys that are supposed to be the building blocks of your franchise, right? Special teamers, guys that are going to contribute. Maybe one of them bubbles up and surprises you, like we thought pre-injury for a guy like Shane Lemieux, right? Like you think that maybe one of these guys can come up and surprise you, but the worst case scenario is supposed to be these are guys that play out a contract. You get 3 years out of them. Maybe you bring them back on a second one, and they allow you to kind of have this baseline. And the New York Giants have never been able to do that. And listen, can it fall at the feet of Dave Gettleman in recent years? Of course it can. But like you said, you can go back further than that and still see the problems that are happening there. Brings me to my point. Coming into the Philadelphia Eagles game, John Mara said, Joe Judge is secure. He is going to be our head coach next year. Now, he said it before the Philadelphia Eagles game. Then you go out, you get absolutely destroyed. Again, more window dressing in a touchdown late in that game. Otherwise, it's a 34-3 massacre. Do you think that John Mara is committed to that, committed to Joe Judge, regardless of how these last few weeks look? Because it's already been bad for a handful of weeks. It's not like they were coming off of really scrappy losses, close last-second field goals, and Mara comes out and says that. He came out and said it ahead of an Eagles game after they'd just gotten their butts kicked the week before and the week before that. So is there anything that can move Mara off of Joe Judge, or do we have to start to, and I'm not saying it for right or wrong, good or bad, that we have to start to think about it as Joe Judge will be back, and it's a matter of who's going to be the GM and what personnel decisions that they make?
I mean, what planet are we living on right now? I've said to you that I like Joe Judge. I like keeping things in house. I like him having a poker face externally. Like, why give the media any like fodder about saying how poorly one of your players performed and putting the spotlight on him? Like,
Sure.
I get all of that, but Joe Judge's shtick of like over effusively being positive is either senile, delusional, or he's lying straight to your face. And like you can take that in tough losses because you're keeping it inside the building. Like, oh, we lost on a heartbreaking field goal, or we didn't catch that fourth down that would have won the game. It's like we're getting the doors blown off right now.
Yeah.
Like the Chargers game, doors blown off. Cowboys never had a shot. The Eagles game was an embarrassment. The defense is like holding on for dear life, giving up 3 points, playing their asses off.
Yeah.
And we can't do anything to stop them in the second half. 30 straight points because we're turning the ball over left and right. We're giving up pick sixes. Like, it is an embarrassment. So
is there anybody out there right now? And I mean, you probably don't have on the tip of your tongue, and neither do I. It's hard to find quarterbacks, but like, do you look at it and say, I'm fine with what they did in only having Mike Glennon and Jake Fromm, because I think we're at the point of need to rebuild. But do you think that they've done a disservice? Because you mentioned the defense. Like, have you done a disservice to the defensive side of the ball by putting Jake Fromm out there to play quarterback? Like, it just feels like you literally walk into the stadium knowing this guy or Mike Glennon, it's over. We're not going to win. Like, should they have just been throwing anybody at the wall here these last few weeks as opposed to walking out a guy that clearly is not ready or capable of playing at an NFL level?
It's about the preparation preseason and understanding what you have is really where it's at. You look at Derek Carr, who gets maligned. He's like a middle of the road quarterback in the league. They went out and they got Marcus Mariota, right? Who has started games, top 5 pick. They made sure that they had someone like that. You look at Tua Tagovailoa. They have Jacoby Brissett sitting behind him, who has started NFL games for the Patriots and the Colts, like, is serviceable. You have these different, teams that, like, Teddy Bridgewater has Drew Lock. Say whatever you want about Drew Lock, but
Arizona Cardinals have Colt McCoy. If only we could have had a player like that at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And look at the Philadelphia Eagles. Look down the street. It's like they have Jalen Hurts. They went out and spent a 5th-round pick on Gardner Minshew.
Yeah.
Would the Giants get? How lucky and fortunate would the Giants be to have Gardner Minshew throwing the ball instead of Mike Glennon or Jake Fromm, right? Like, it comes down to the preparation prior to the season and understanding, like, hey, listen, if you have a star quarterback and like you want to invest just in a bridge guy that can win you one game, like, I get it. But like, no one really knows who sits behind Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady, because like, if they go down with a huge injury, like, the season is kind of toast. It's these middle of the road quarterbacks, which I think Daniel Jones falls into, where you got to have a guy as a backup that can continue to keep the ship going. And the Giants failed to do that. Maybe they thought that Mike Glennon was the answer at that because he has had starts under his belt, but clearly it's another incorrect decision. And at some point, when you make 20 incorrect decisions in a row, you can't chalk it up to bad luck. You have to say, are we just not evaluating things the right way anymore?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think that's what it does come down to, because again, like, it's easy to get caught up with the big draft picks, and those matter obviously, and the hits and misses there. But if you're bad at the highest level where the talent is supposed to be the easiest to evaluate, then it only gets harder as you fall into these murky areas of backup quarterbacks and back end of the roster guys. Last thing before I want to get into, I just want to cover the draft situation for the Giants. The Bears surprisingly upset the Seattle Seahawks. That hurts us, but thankfully we keep losing and we have them on tap this weekend. But do you think that, I think I may have said this last episode too, but I feel like it's worth beating this drum about. They've been saying that, Patrick Graham is going to get some opportunities here this offseason. Do you look at this defense and the way they've played and how he's kept them focused, and they've had players in and out of their lineup, and they've done it with Band-Aids and, smoke and mirrors and everything else? Do you think that John Mara should be willing to go into the offseason, not assuming that Joe Judge is automatically the head coach, and maybe looking at a coach on the staff and saying, listen, if we're going to go into next year and maybe there's going to be a new GM, what would be the harm in giving Patrick Graham a year at the helm? And if it went totally belly up, we know it's the start of the rebuild. Okay, we can move on with our new GM and he'll bring in his coach. But I don't want to get into that weird, Ben McAdoo, Tom Coughlin kind of space where it's like you don't want to lose the guy, but John Mara at least has to be capable of stepping back and saying, like, the only good thing we've seen out of this coaching staff has been Graham. Nothing else has looked right or good. Special teams has not looked right or good a lot of the times, and that's can come down to an individual player in Dixon in the punting game, certainly. But does that evaluation need to happen, or is that getting ahead of it in terms of, yeah, the defense has been good, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to being head coaching material?
It seems like that's a band-aid fix for the larger systemic problem. And it's what we've done in the past where it's like, oh, Dave Gettleman is probably going to retire. Do we promote Kevin Abrams because he's from within?
Well, how about this, though? You brought him up, and listen, I'm going to derail this thing completely. Abrams at the time, like all these reports now coming out that organizationally, that Abrams didn't want to go in the same direction as Dave Gettleman, and Dave Gettleman overrid everybody, right? He didn't want to go with Saquon Barkley. He didn't necessarily, I'm trying to remember what the other one was. It was a little bit further back where Kevin Abrams was basically like, yeah, these are the guys we want to go for. Kevin Abrams was on the Quentin Nelson, Nick Chubb, first, second round tandem back in 2018. And he got overridden by Dave Gettleman. Said, no, we're going with this gold jacket wearer Saquon Barkley, and then we're going with Will Hernandez. That's the really interesting thing, because Abrams interviewed for the GM job at the time, and by and large, all the reports were everybody that came in the door said, yeah, I would want the opportunity to move on from Eli Manning, rebuild this thing. John Mara didn't want that. Gettleman came in and said, I don't care. I'll do whatever you want. He gets the job, and Abrams ends up sitting in the wings. So even though we consider him to be a money man, it's interesting to hear those reports that, hey, here's a guy that maybe would have gone a different direction had he been given the chance.
Yeah, I mean, you hear those reports all the time. I don't think there's a single head coach or GM or scouting department that hasn't come out so far and been like, we were all in on Patrick Mahomes. Someone else just happened to pick him up.
Thing,
right? Yeah, like McAdoo wanted him and would have traded every asset for him. Every single person, in theory, wanted Patrick Mahomes now that like the time has passed, right? But to me, you just talked about Kevin Abrams being the money guy. One of our biggest problems is that we're in cap hell, right? Like we have $4 million of cap. We are in the bottom 6 or 7 of the league in terms of amount of cap space. The other 6 teams all currently in the playoffs right now. So we're like, I get it if you're going for it and you're going to win and you need to like figure out the cap next year and continue to punt. The Giants don't have that luxury, and they're on a rookie quarterback. And like, so how can we be in this situation? You can't be the assistant GM and have influence in this whole decision-making process and then say, well, I wanted all these guys and Gettleman went this way. Well, I didn't want to sign that guy, but Gettleman did it. It's like, you're responsible for the finances. You could look at Dave Gettleman and say, we cannot get Kenny Golladay because it's going to crush our cap.
Right.
Like, we cannot do that under any circumstances. We cannot sign this guy for X amount of money. We cannot release Kevin Zeitler because he's our best guy and the value of a replacement on the market is not there. But again, he can't be the second in command and all of a sudden put his hands away from the wheel and say, I had no responsibility at all in this.
No, and Joe Judge can't say it, and Abrams can't say it, and Gettleman can't say it, and John Mara can't say it. And it always comes back up to the top there. It just feels like John Mara. And by the way, when I talk about Kevin Abrams that way, like it's almost like I have, 3% of the loyalty gene inside of me that John Mara does, where like he's been here, who knows, maybe if he had an opportunity, right? Like, and it circles that drain where you really need to clear house and get things back on track in a new direction.
Put him in as a president of operations or something. Like, it's okay to keep Kevin Abrams in house. It's not okay to promote him to the head guy in charge when he's been in the mix of the last decade and a half of futility, right? Like, that's the problem,
right? Which would be, and maybe that extends to Joe Judge again, right? Now you're a part of the ineptitude as well, and if you get another year and it looks bad, now you're inside of that decade plus long bubble where things have been terrible. Last thing is Giants lose, Bears win. They sit there at 5-8 now in the draft. They're going to play each other this weekend. I think it makes the most sense right now. Just if we always get to game day, and I always give you my 17-16 prediction. It's becoming a bit of a trend. But now I think you want the Bears to win this game if you're just talking purely from a draft standpoint, because what's the benefit of pulling kind of the middle of the top 10? The Giants can get as high as 3 in the NFL draft right now. When you look at the Houston Texans, and you see that they're, the only teams you're not going to catch are going to be the Lions and the Jaguars. You can get as high as 3. And that's the difference between a couple of defensive talents, offensive tackle talents that are going to be available there as well. That's the state of things. And for a team that we talked about being on par with so many, man, I thought about it. Washington got blown out by the Cowboys. Okay, they got blown out, but they were still in it. Like they were still in the mix all the way until week 15 and 16 of having an opportunity to do something. So is Philadelphia. So even the Bears are winning games late in the season. The longer that this year goes on, is the worse and worse that the Giants actually look, because outside of the defensive side of the ball, when Joe Judge tells you, I saw a lot of positive things, like, you're kidding yourself. The entire offensive side of the ball is an absolute wreck. 50% of this roster is an absolute disaster. No other team, even the worst of teams, you'd rather be Detroit right now than be the New York Football Giants, because at least you have this head coach the players all really love, and who knows how the Giants feel about Joe Judge, but you have this head coach that everyone loves. They're playing hard. They've only won 2 games, and they've had a tie, but they feel like they're doing the right things. They're going in the right direction. Like, there's optimism in Detroit with 2 wins. There's none of that for the New York Football Giants. You're at the precipice of the cliff of falling off of it and jettisoning everything that you've purchased and built up over the last 3-4 years. Like, I don't know where I was going with that. I'm just depressed.
Okay, so I listen. I felt the same thing, because you want to like just talk about the event and the frustration. That there's, I will pose a question back to you in a second, but let me get to your draft piece of it first. You are correct. The best thing for the Giants to do would be to lose to the Chicago Bears, because would you rather pick in a hypothetical situation? Would you rather pick 3rd and 9th or 5th and 7th? I think you want the premium talent at 3 if you have your choice, right? The challenge is the Giants would need to leapfrog either the Jets or the Texans. The Jets have to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Buffalo Bills. Don't really see them winning a game there. The Texans have to play the 49ers and the Titans. So they're both playing like playoff teams. Now, we haven't gone too deep into this in terms of if they end up all with the same, 4-win record or whatever it is. How does strength of schedule play in? The Giants are there now, but like the Jets and like, who knows, right? So I'm with you on that. I think there's a couple of other things. You talk about there's no positives. Let me give you a stat. And I've been talking about, like, I noticed this trend, and it sounds like other people have as well. The Giants have been outscored 65-0 in the last 2 minutes of the first half this season.
So I just want to jump in real quick. You said there was a positive?
Well, who said it? Who said that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I misheard. I thought you were about to give me a silver lining. Please continue. No. I'm ready to be depressed.
So I'm saying to you, I'm in agreement. Listen, 65-0 means 2 things, right? It means, 1, we haven't operated the 2-minute drill as an offense at all, because we haven't even scored a single point in the last 2 minutes of the half, right?
Sure.
The second thing is we're giving up 65 points in the last 2 minutes of the first half. Like, that means every game, basically someone's getting 6 points, 5 points. Like, there's either a touchdown or a field goal being had. And that speaks to your, like, there's no silver lining to this thing. There's not. And it is bleak. Oh. We do have questions about our quarterback. Our GM's leaving. We don't know if the head coach is our guy. And I'll ask you one question.
Sure.
If this isn't rock bottom right now, what could be rock bottom? Like we have no hope in sight. We don't know if our head coach and our quarterback are the right ones. We don't have salary cap. Our ownership is clearly part of the problem. They may promote from within and continue this systemic nepotism and just like whatever. Like, give me, like, is this rock bottom? And if it's not, what is it?
Yeah, no, it has to be. And the reason why probably is because we know at the end of next year, you start to see some of the cap space come back in. They start to be able to make some decisions. So in theory, this is rock bottom, because every step, and let's just say at the end of this year, right? Starting with the NFL draft next year, everything they do is the beginning of the process of getting out of all the problems that they've been in, right? Like that, you're starting to go in that direction. Now, the problem is, if you don't get rid of Dave Gettleman, if you don't get rid of anyone that you feel like it has not been a part of the solution there, then you can trip yourself up. Because, by the way, we could have been sitting here right now talking about how rock bottom was last year. And starting with this past draft, we were starting to put the pieces in place to have success. But instead, you still had Dave Gettleman, right? You don't know about the head coach. You don't know anything more about Daniel Jones. And that can even go back further, right? You go out and you spend big money in free agency when you probably shouldn't have. Could the Giants have won 4 games without Kenny Galladay or Adoree Jackson? Yeah, probably. You know what I mean? Like that's the problem is you still went and spent these big dollars that now have 1, 2, 3, 4-year ramifications on your franchise. So right at the precipice when you could have said, we're starting to get our cap back in order, we're starting to rebuild this franchise, you went out and spent money, and all that did was push it back one more year. So the question will become, is Dave Gettleman 100% gone? And if so, is John Mara ready to give it over to a new GM that will say, hey, we got to strip this thing for parts, figure out where we need to address issues, fix the offensive line, and move forward from there. But, rock bottom is only as low as you can dig. And there's no guarantee that John Mara does not still have a shovel in his hand. And that's the problem. We don't know how deep he can go here because we said this for years now, right? We feel like we've been on this ride for years. And just when you thought you got to the basement and then the substructure and then the dirt beneath it, John Mara said, no, I got a backhoe. I'm going to take out one more big scoop and jump in it. And so that's John Mara. He's not going anywhere. So we can talk about everybody else that moves away from this franchise. It still comes down to what John Mara chooses to do.
Well, so I asked that question because I had thought about it this morning, and I think the Giants winning out the next 2 games, and then Chicago losing this game, and then winning Week 17, and Joe Judge being announced back, Kevin Abrams being promoted to GM is probably the worst case scenario. And then at the end of the season, like then you're like the silver lining is the season is over. We can't lose any more football games. But at the end of the day, the issue becomes it's more of the same next season with less draft capital than we thought we were going to have.
Yeah, 100%, man. There's going to be big decisions to make there. I've already started to develop some thoughts around where the Giants could spend some of these draft picks, things that they might try to do in the first couple of rounds here. And we'll start to get into that. We're only a couple of weeks away from getting into playoff football for everyone else. And then we'll start to think about what's possible for the New York Football Giants. That was fun. I feel good. And I'm really bummed out that I misheard Andy when he said, I'm going to give you a depressing stat. I thought it was supposed to be a positive stat, and then hit me with even the defense that's been fighting its tail off is still getting outscored 65-0 as we head towards those halftime breaks. We'll be back in previewing the Chicago Bears game, talking about what they've done at the quarterback position, who was their veteran backups to have experience behind a young rookie quarterback and have a good room where you could still go out and win some football games. We'll do that all coming up on Friday. You can follow us on social media. You can download, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. And as always, Andy Makowitz wants, needs, and demands the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.
Ting.